Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 5th session of the Future Leaders Group training sessions. Today, we've got Iain Mitchell, QC, talking about open source and procurement. And just a little introduction about the Future Leaders Group. It's a group of lawyers and non-lawyers who support the work of OpenUK in all things open. So Amanda's going to do a brief introduction for Iain. So over to Amanda.
Thanks very much, Katie. Katie is the co-chair of the Future Leaders Group, which has morphed out of our Legal and Policy Committee. We're very excited that they are now working on a review of terms and conditions and procurement processes across UK Gov. So I think there's quite a number of those online today, Iain, to hear your pearls of wisdom influencing their process and their project. I'm really delighted to introduce you all to Iain Mitchell, QC, who is a very old friend of both me and OpenUK. He's in fact our honorary QC. I don't think many organisations have an honorary QC. Iain is someone who has done endless amounts of work on a pro bono basis and otherwise for open source across the UK and in Europe. If you take a look at his bio, there are far too many committees and good works that Iain is involved with for me to mention them today. I will tell you quickly that on a personal level, my sadly departed father was not very good at driving and had a number of speeding tickets and was at the stage where he was about to lose his licence until Iain stepped in for me and represented him on his final speeding ticket. Thankfully, it was a final speeding ticket. He lived many years more, but I think Iain put the fear of God into him and he never sped in his vehicle again. So Iain has a very broad-ranging experience. It's not specific to open source, which is why he is one of the people best placed to do this talk today. He's got a great deal of experience in the public sector, and I think we're all going to learn something new today. And with that, Iain, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody, and I see lots of names and muted microphones. I assume you can all see me okay. Maybe when we get to the discussion at the end, if you wanted to contribute, please start your video at the same, so I can actually at that point see you, but we get better quality if we just stay on mute at the moment. Right, well, the self-evident first question is, why do we have a procurement system at all? The answer to that is that it's rooted in the treaties establishing the European Union and their predecessors, and particularly Article 3.3 of the Treaty on European Union, which provides the Union shall establish an internal market, and so on and so forth. And then Articles 26 and 27 on the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, the Union is given power to adopt measures with the aim of establishing or ensuring the functioning of the internal market in accordance with the relevant provisions of the treaties. By the way, I'll interject to say, I do hope you just enjoy the talk. I'm not giving you any kind of PowerPoint. I think it's much better that you just see me and we have a chat together. So, however, when I cite things, you might want to pay particular attention and note them down. So the single market is founded on the 4 principles, the 4 freedoms: the freedom of movement of goods, the freedom of movement of services, freedom of movement of capital, and the freedom of movement of persons. And in the procurement field, the 2 of those that are the most obviously engaged are goods and services. So because of that, there have been public procurement directives since, in the case of public works, 1971, and in the case of public supply, 1977. The story for our purposes really begins with the 2004 directives, the Public Sector Directive, the Utilities Directive, and the Remedies Directive, which followed along in 2007. And a lot of the cases I'll be looking at originated with reference to those directives. There's now in force a new set of directives, the Public Procurement Directive of 2014 and the Utilities Sectors Directive and the Concessions Directive, again, all of 2014. But the principles that they embody are the same, really, as the 2004 principles, though with some very helpful clarifications and improvements and changes. Now, I'm cheating a little bit because you think I'm looking at you on the screen. What I'm actually looking at is an annotated version of the revised chapter for the new edition of the book on, this is the original edition, Free and Open Source Software Policy, Law and Practice, which was correct as at 2013. So the old directives were in place then. And
may I interrupt?
Yeah.
So, since you've shown the book, I will mention that I'm the editor of the second edition. It will be published by OUP. We've pushed it back to January 2021 for publication. And Iain has written the chapter on public procurement. The book will not just be available for sale, but thanks to the Veitch Foundation will be available in open access as a PDF and an e-reader. So you'll all be able to access that come next January. We may even try and accelerate Iain's chapter based on the work you're all doing at Future Leaders.
That's great. A little bit has changed since particularly the 2014 directive, since that chapter was written. I'll come back in a minute to talk about how the software landscape has changed since then. But basically, the way that the directives operate is that there are minimum thresholds below which the directives don't apply. And as at the moment, the minimum threshold is €5,350,000. But that certainly doesn't mean that EU procurement law doesn't affect the any public contract below that 5 and a bit million threshold. Because you have to understand the whole reason for having the procurement law was the perceived mischief of public authorities making direct awards of contracts basically to their chums and mates, or it may well be in certain jurisdictions the people who have the fattest brown envelope. And it's utterly fundamental to preserving the single market that any public contract with a cross-border element has got to meet certain minimum principles. And they're known as the treaty principles, which can include both principles laid down in the treaties and principles derived from the treaty principles. They are specifically equal treatment, non-discrimination, mutual recognition, proportionality, and transparency. Equal treatment, non-discrimination, mutual recognition, proportionality, and transparency. So any public procurement has got to meet the public procurement principles. That was whether or not above or below threshold. There's a case which establishes that back in 2001, Bent Münster against Spotgroup, and I'm not going to even begin to pronounce the other word, but it's best usually known as the Bent Münster case. But when you actually analyze out the authorities, you get the court treating the cases into two categories. One is cases which fall above, or procurements which fall above the threshold, and those which fall below. In reality, I think it's more helpful to adopt a tripartite division. And in actually, I say slightly modestly, I developed this categorization myself. And argued it in a case known as Sidey against Clackmannan Council, which was a case for doing up, involving a contract for doing up kitchens and bathrooms in council houses in Clackmannanshire. And the way that I think the helpful way to look at it is, there are cases where there is or is not a cross-border interest. Now, as long as there's a cross-border interest, the treaty principles are engaged. When there isn't, they aren't, because of course the foundation of the treaty is the foundation of the single market. And if there's a very, very small local contract by a local authority, at which there's no cross-border interest whatever, well, they can do what they jolly well like, at least in relation to procurement law. They can just essentially ignore the procurement law. When we were arguing the Clackmannan case, we had a kind of interesting running example, that an example of that might be a local council office, and they send the office junior out at lunchtime to buy the sandwiches. That is a local authority procurement, but it doesn't have a cross-border interest. Though I did mischievously suggest, would it be any different if the local authority office was sitting in a small town on the Dutch and Belgian border, and the office junior could either buy the sandwiches in the Netherlands or in Belgium? Then there would be a cross-border interest in a procurement which might have a total value of, say, €5. Anyway, that was more of a joke than it was a serious point, but there's a serious point hidden within it. So there are three classes. First, there are those which are of such a negligible value that no cross-border interest is likely to arise. Second, there's those contracts, not in the first category, which fall below threshold. And in that case, there is essentially a rebuttable presumption that no cross-border interest arises. But of course, that presumption can be overcome and rebutted. On a bigger scale, my sandwich example, but suppose it's not sandwiches, but something, well, renovation of council houses, for example. And that would always be a question of fact, but you start from the presumption that there's no cross-border interest. And the true significance of the directives, as the cases explain it, is that quite simply what they do is to provide a level above which there is an irrebuttable presumption that there's a cross-border interest. So there's your thing. No cross-border interest, rebuttable presumption that no cross-border interest. Those are the two that lie below threshold, and above threshold, it is irrebuttably presumed that there is a cross-border interest. So that is essentially how the system works, and the directives specify what has to be done to provide a treaty-compliant outcome in these above-threshold contracts. The Sidey case was interesting because it was below threshold, but the council chose to follow the rules set out in the directive, and being a not very well-resourced local council, got them all marvellously wrong. But that's another story, and the citation will be in the book, and you can read all about it. So where does the problem arise? Particularly in relation to open source software. Well, in the first case, there's two sides of the same coin, as it was, I explained it in the 2013 edition. The first is that procurement authorities don't want, for whatever reason, to buy open source software. And the other side of the coin is a local authority which does, or a not necessarily a local authority, of course, could be a government authority, a public authority that does want to buy open source software, but is afraid that they might be open to challenge if they specify open source software. And as the market looked in 2013, those were really very sharply and acutely what the issues were. If, however, you now look at the picture in 2020, there's been some blurring of that, and it's simply because of the rise of cloud computing and software as a service, so that quite often it can be immaterial to the procuring authority whether or not the software is open source or not open source, because they're not actually necessarily judging their acquisition on the basis of the software, they're judging it on the basis of the service offered. But it only slightly disguises the problem, because an acquiring authority with any nous might come to realize that the basis, the software basis of the service is an important component in the service. I will be talking a little bit later about a case in Piedmont, but that's a bit later in the talk. So what then are the specific issues which arise if we look at procurement issues through the lens of open source software? Well, first, the question, is there procurement at all? Obviously, the directives and the treaty principles don't apply in the private sector. So if it's a private sector acquisition, the rules are irrelevant. However, even in the public sector, there can be a situation where there is no procurement at all. The first example might be a public authority simply in-house develops its own software. That doesn't involve any procurement. Though down the line, if what happens is they then want to let a contract for development of that software or to provide a service using that as a platform, then you do get into an acquisition exercise. Or again, if the local authority downloads the software for free, then there isn't a procurement because they're not buying anything. There's no public contract within the meaning of the definitions. Slightly reminds me of a case years ago I did in the licensing area, where there was a hotel in Edinburgh which, for complicated reasons, was opening, but it couldn't get its, through no fault of its own, it couldn't get its drinks license. And it didn't want to be the proverbial pub with no beer. But it dawned on me that you require a license to sell drink, but you don't require a license to give it away free. So we developed a scheme to enable them demonstrably to give drink away free to guests. And that got around the problem. And of course, the same thing here, that if the public authority is acquiring the software for free, there's no procurement. And that doesn't, although that might sound a bit fanciful, in fact, the European e-government services published back in 2010 a guideline on public procurement of open source software, which at paragraph 2.3 gives guidance for best practice for downloading for free. So it is an economic model that some acquirers demonstrably do use. The next issue which arises, assuming there is a procurement, is can the tenderer end up effectively shooting himself in the foot? Because what if the would-be tenderer or his employees had been involved in the preparation of the contracting authority's invitation to tender? That would give an unfair advantage to that particular tenderer, and plainly would be contrary to the treaty principles. Or again, what if the local authority, the public authority had downloaded open source software and developed it itself, was then wanting a contract further to develop it, and suppose that its former chief developer had gone off to join the private sector, or it had floated off its IT department, then again that would shut those people with some knowledge of how the system operates out from the tendering process. Because of course, again, it would give them an inside track. And in fact, that latter case, there was a case about it, Fabricom, in 2005, dealing with that very issue. So I'd say in summary to this, a would-be tenderer should be really vigilant for possible involvement by a competitor at an earlier stage, and a contracting authority should be careful lest it end up accidentally running the risk of disqualifying a person whom it might have wished had been free to tender. Now, the 2014 directive actually formalizes a way in which this experience can be shared. It creates something known as an innovation partnership. And a local authority can, under the 2014 directive, form an innovation partnership with a partner. Recital 49 states that this partnership should allow contracting authorities to establish a long-term innovation partnership for the development and subsequent purchase of a new innovative product, service, or works, provided that such innovative product or service or innovative works can be delivered to agreed performance levels and costs without the need for a separate procurement procedure for the purchase. So that does give scope for collaborative working, and it might be something that would-be tenderers might want to think about. Now, we come to the main issue, which is, as always, issues with the specification. Once upon a time, well, it's not terribly much an issue now, there was a tendency in the early days to specify that you wanted a particular a system, like you wanted something that ran, you wanted a, I don't know, a new internal system based on Microsoft Office. Or, of course, the other side of that coin, you could specify open source. So what are the issues that arise there? Well, let's take the simple one first, the Microsoft Office example, or to be more exact, it was a case in the Netherlands, as Münster, sorry, I beg your pardon, it was, yes, European Commission against the Netherlands. And it was an IT contract where the requiring authorities specified Unix. Now that went to the European Court, who found that that was just impermissible. And at the very least, the words or equivalent should be added, because we just specify a brand name, you're cutting out all sorts of possible competition. But another way to shut people out is, and this is much more alive, instead of badging, is to add the magic words or equivalent where there is no equivalent. In other words, you create exclusively technical specifications. You know, a specification such that only one potential tenderer is in a position to meet it. And that doesn't only happen with procurements in Sicily involving brown envelopes and specifications written in such a way that they're tailored so that only the person with the biggest brown envelope can meet it. It can actually arise perfectly innocently. And the leading case was Concordia Bus, Finland. Again, that was in 2002. And that was involving a case involving the award by the city of Helsinki of a contract for operating of buses for its public transport system. and they set a minimum technical level for nitrogen oxide emissions. And there was only one tenderer, and that wasn't Concordia. Concordia put in the lowest price, but it couldn't meet the technical specifications. So when the rival tenderer was given the contract, and incidentally, the rival tenderer belonged to the city of Helsinki, Concordia cried foul and went to court. And essentially, it's a big case, and it's well worth looking at. But what it distills down to is, in paragraph 149 of the Advocate General's opinion, he stated, "It follows from settled case law that the principle of equality of treatment requires that comparable situations are not treated differently, and that different situations are not treated similarly, unless such a difference in treatment can be justified objectively." Or putting it even more crisply, if a public authority comes up with a technically exclusive tender, can they objectively justify that a tender? And of course, the case found, the court found in the same lines as the Advocate General did. So that's what the law is. And it was underlined, and the question of objectivity in EVN AG against Weinstrom GmbH v Austria, a case in 2003, where the court stressed at paragraph 34, that was a case involving renewable energy sources, that there is not an unrestricted freedom of choice which is conferred on the authority, and the authority can't arbitrarily select the criteria. It's got to be able to justify the criteria objectively. And that was underlined by advice from the European Commission following Concordia Bus, harping back to the question of brand name, that a brand name to describe a product can be used only when there is no other possible descriptions that are both sufficiently precise and intelligible to potential tenderers. Well, theory is fine, but what about practice? I want to talk to you about a case called Elector Limited against Common Services Agency, 2011 Scots Law Times 815. Now, it doesn't reveal in the old edition of the book, nor in the new edition, that I was actually involved at a very early stage in that case. And I do treat the case extensively in the book, because it does actually reveal a lot of elementary errors and actually lets you test this idea of objective justification. But I do have to confess that I waited several years to write the book, and revenge is a dish that's best served cold. What actually happened was that NHS in Scotland had a contract for the replacement of linear accelerators in the 6 hospitals in Scotland which deliver radiotherapy in the treatment of cancer. Now, a linear accelerator is a fabulously expensive bit of kit. I mean, it's millions and millions of pounds. I think it was a £25 million contract to replace these linear accelerators. But as simple hardware, they're just ever so much junk. You can just point it vaguely in the direction of the patient, and with any luck, you might hit the cancer. So it requires very, very, very sophisticated software to control and direct it. 5 of the existing linear accelerators were, the ones that are being replaced, had originally been provided by a company called Varian. And Varian had their own proprietary software to control the accelerators. I was engaged in the first instance by Elector to seek to challenge that, because Elector simply was unable to tender because it couldn't meet the requirement which was made by NHS Scotland, which is that the new kit should be capable of working with the already existing software. You know, it's a classic case of vendor lock-in. The original operating software can only operate Varian systems. So, you know, Varian gets a monopoly. And in fact, the monopoly is compounded because 1 out of the 5 was a different system. And this, of course, created, you know, it extended the lock-in to the 6th linear accelerator. Now, the little story was I turned up for the initial consultation, and I was making life very uncomfortable for Elector by asking all kinds of focused questions. But I think they didn't rather like the sort of the questions I was asking. So, and I'm not going to tell you any more because I don't want to do anything to breach legal professional privilege, but suffice it to say that I found myself sacked over the lunch break, and they proceeded with not a member of the faculty, but a solicitor advocate. And the case that they ran was quite simply that this created the lock-in, they couldn't tender, there wasn't a level playing field. They were met by NHS Scotland arguing that a public authority cannot, in the interests of equal treatment, be compelled to seek tenders for something it doesn't want. And the judge recorded that there was, and the judge said that is correct, and the judge recorded, as senior counsel for the defender submitted, there's been no attack on the present procurement exercise on the grounds that the criteria adopted by the defender are not objectively justifiable. And the solicitor advocate for the pursuer in his oral argument did not seek to argue that they were not objectively justifiable. So there was an open goal sitting there and nobody fired the ball to it. And not surprisingly, the argument not having been made, and the judge even having articulated the argument and remarked that it hadn't been made, Varian won. And then the totally insufferable thing was, for years after, the NHS went round all these conferences proudly boasting that they have a procurement system second to none. Look, it was approved by the Court of Session. So you can see Elector possibly as being an example of, you know, perhaps objective justifiability is not an important criterion, but I rather tend to think that it's merely Elector was badly argued. So I'm going to come back to that theme in a moment when I do say a little bit more about just how you do argue objective justification. But I do want to interject a little to talk about the specifying of open source, because when I consider the broader issue, I want to look at what happens if you're using open source as a criterion for wanting or not wanting software. Well, the easy answer, and I've not spent a lot of time on it, though I do spend a lot of time on it in the book, is that if you specify, well, we've already discovered, sorry, if you specify open source, then it's not a brand name. It's simply a type of a licensing regime, and indeed it may reflect on the quality of the software itself. And there is absolutely no reason on God's earth why a procuring authority cannot specify open source. It's not as though it's specifying a particular brand. Now, there's two cases which can briefly be mentioned in that regard, but they underline that there's a case in Italy Well, there's a case in France about the Picardy region, and then in 2010 there's a case in Italy involving the region of Piedmont. That was commented on by our close friend Carlo Piana, who's also a member of the Open Forum Europe, European Legal Network. And although the court expressed the view that one of the criteria which can be used is licensing regime in arguing objective and justifiability, Carlo argues, yes, you can, but it's not only a question of technical of the licensing characteristics, it can also be a question of technical and economic merit. And nothing prevents a proprietary vendor from choosing a more liberal license or to confer more rights if it weighs favorably. So we come then to the excluding of the open source. And I've already said that simply just excluding it could theoretically be justified if you can come up with an objectively justifiable reason for it. And this takes us back into the question of how you argue objective justifiability. Well, there's, in the vendor lock-in case, the classic economic argument. And the issue in the Elector case was that Elector looked only, the NHS Scotland looked only at the headline cost, i.e. we're not going to have to replace all this software, it's cheaper if we don't have to do that. But they took no account of the ongoing cost of perpetuating, or indeed, as it actually happened, extending the lock-in. Even back when that case was argued, that it's arguable that there's no objective justifiability to this, because the reasoning was flawed. But there's no excuse now for not looking at the malign effects of vendor lock-in, because Articles 67 and 68 of the 2014 Public Sector Directive specifically say that one must take into account essentially a life cycle costing exercise. And there is a UK government paper on open standards principles for software interoperability, data and document formats in government IT specifications, which was published in 2012. And it states at page 14, short-term financial savings based only on cost could risk longer-term lock-in and are not necessarily the most cost-effective in terms of whole life or when broader cross-government working or reuse is considered. So, and then you come to Article 67.2, and it states specifically that the criteria that are included can include quality, including technical merit, aesthetic and functional characteristics, accessibility, design for all users, social, environmental, and innovative characteristics, as well also as the life cycle cost criterion. So you've got a much more open and liberal regime now, which actually gives much more scope to a procuring authority to look not just at the question of what's cheapest, but also to take into account all kinds of other issues. So there is an argument to be run that for whatever of these reasons, open source is simply better, and most certainly should not be excluded, and indeed it would be justified to specify open source. That, however, is a bit of special pleading, and I think anybody in the open source community is perfectly happy to let open source stand or fall on its own merits, not necessarily encouraging procuring authorities to specify open source, but just knowing that open source has inherent superiorities, just get in there and pitch based on the broader issues that I've been outlining. Now, I've got about a couple of minutes left before I open to questions. I just wanted to say a couple of words about well, the UK. But before I do that, if I were to summarize the position is quite simply that the European procurement regime does actually give a very fruitful ground in which open source can take root and grow. And since 2014, a lot of the thinking which had been implicit is now explicit in the new directives, and all power to the open source developers' elbows. The UK is in this funny period between Brexit and the end of the transition period. So everything I've said continues to apply to the United Kingdom exactly. Now, the UK government has said that post, well, what we thought was 31st January, 31st December 2020, and I just spotted a typo in my manuscript, which I can correct later. I accidentally stayed January at one point. Yeah, 31st, sorry, what happens between 31st December 2020? The government says, well, of course, the rules will continue to apply, and indeed they will. They'll be sort of domesticated, become part of UK law. But it isn't, I'm afraid, as easy as that, because remember I said that the directives cover above threshold contracts and not below threshold contracts. Below threshold contracts, the law is derived from the treaties. And of course, if the treaties no longer apply, query whether these principles will extend to below threshold contracts, even though they might continue to apply to above threshold contracts. At the moment, there's a regulatory vacuum. That's just simply not spelled out. Well, I'm sure it's something which can be addressed in the year to come. And the government has also said that, but of course that will be affecting procurements up until the end of the transition period. What's to happen at the end of the transition period? Are they going to continue? Are the same rules going to continue in relation, and who will they apply to? Will it simply be UK-wide, or will it apply abroad? Abroad then will include the EU. Well, what the government said is it'll go back to the World Trade Organization agreement and government procurement, or not go back to, because although the EU is a signatory, the United Kingdom isn't, and that's another one of the 1001 treaties that the UK is going to have to accede to in its own rights. So it's an interesting and a very uncertain place as to what's going to happen later. And there's not much more I can say to you about Brexit, except probably I know about as much as the government does, which is to say not very much. So I'll open things now to questions. And if you want to ask a question, could you let me see you as well as you hear you?
Ian, that's really fascinating. Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing the book chapter. You may have noticed that I added something to the group chat saying that perhaps we could share the chapter with this group, or with the Future Leaders group at least, as it goes through the editing phase. I don't imagine that would be a problem for OUP, and as I'm editing it, it would be a great help to me to have other people's feedback. So let's commit to doing that on this call. I was interested, I was going to ask you about Brexit, obviously, and I'm not sure if you know, a few of us from the Legal and Policy Group actually went and met with UKTI back on the 6th of February They were looking at some of the source code provisions in the existing international treaties and how those would be impacted in terms of open source, which was a very interesting discussion. They were taking input from a number of organisations. I'm hoping, because we've shared today's session with them, that some of those people involved may also take a look at the session. If you were to give one piece of advice to any of those people working on the treaties and thinking about open and procurement, I wonder what that would be, if that's not too hard a question.
No, well, you see, the self-evident thing to do would be to keep the existing regime running, but that hits you with an enormous big political problem, because it's inherent in the existing regime that you open up the competition to economic enterprises throughout the existing EU. Well, there's two things you could do. One way would be to keep the present regime running, but to restrict it to only UK tenderers. I don't think that's hugely attractive. What one could be doing if the government is talking about acceding to the WTO procurement regime, then they could, the WTO doesn't affect all countries in the world, there's only a given number of signatories. So they could actually delete EU and substitute instead signatories, companies based in signatory states to the WTO agreement. And that would include the EU, but it would also include the US and quite a lot of other countries. And I think that would be a sensible way to do it. It would actually end up widening rather than narrowing. And I'm a great believer in the virtues of free trade and competition.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Iain. I wonder, from the Future Leaders Group in particular, I'm sure there's going to be some questions, getting some advice for a head start in their contract review, which they're about to kick off with. And they're looking at GDS, CCS and NHS terms and conditions. Of course, we haven't thought about NHS Scotland. We've thought about NHS England, but we should probably add NHS Scotland to the list of things.
Yeah, you think you should. Especially since back in 2011, they hadn't a clue about procurement.
Now, Iain, are you sure that's what you want to say about it?
I'm sure they know a lot better now. I think they probably realised that their great victory in the Elector case came about not because of the robustness of their procurement a regime so much as an own goal being scored by, basically, I mean, objectively, I was joking about revenge dish best served cold, but if you actually look at it, you actually do see that the judge himself realized that there was a clear argument there they might even have been persuaded on, and then did the classic thing one does in a common law jurisdiction. You don't decide things on the basis of an argument that's not been put to you as a judge. So basically, in judicial language, he says, well, there is this argument here, but, well, search me why it wasn't actually argued. And because it wasn't, I don't need to consider it.
Mm. So do we have questions for Iain? I think they might all be a bit nervous, Iain, but let's hope there's one.
No, I don't bite.
Not in a situation like this, at least, Iain. Magdalena.
I have a question. Do you consider, Iain, that the only way to really include open source requirement in the procurement is a public pressure of the institutions, like, for example, OpenUK and other open source advocates that will be basically pressuring the governments to include that? No, actually. The way you do it is to build a better product so people want to buy it. Because, it's one of the things I was saying about the change that now we've, because public procurement is so much more now just about buying services. And they're going to score it and decide it on the basis of, which is the better product for our needs. And the average procurement authority probably couldn't care less if it was open source or not open source, because gone are the days when what people primarily consider themselves to be buying is actual software.
it's the service that's built on the software. And I don't think, I mean, you can lobby government to ask government to specify that that particular government wants open source software solutions. You have to have a reason why that's objectively justifiable, and no doubt reasons can be produced. And the government, you know, basically what I said, you can't exclude open source software, that would be unlawful. You can specify open source software, that is perfectly lawful, or you can be silent about what you want. And as long as open source software isn't excluded, the best product or service is going to win. And it doesn't harm to be trying to encourage people who want to procure to specify open source, but it really doesn't matter if they do or not, if you've got confidence in what you're selling.
I think that's interesting, Ian. One of the points that came up repeatedly back in November at the OSS 2020 or beyond 2020 and beyond, I think it is, the Commission's work on open source, and we've got a couple of European colleagues on this call today, was maintenance and support.
Yes, yes,
and people asking about not just the software itself and knowing that the software would continue to be maintained by a development community if it was an open product, but also knowing that they could get support. And there are a number of issues come up around SMEs, their ability to meet tender qualifications for open procurement, which is away from the terms and more into the process. But the difficulty as SMEs have, and also making sure that you can demonstrate that you can provide support at scale. And for a lot of SMEs, they couldn't provide the support at the scale that something like the Commission would need. And it's a matter of collaborating or working with the SIs who traditionally have done that, which was quite interesting. I think Christian Patterson just flashed up on the screen, one of our colleagues in France. Christian, did you have a question?
Yeah, actually, I've got two questions. They're kind of completely different, but maybe they're hopefully they're interesting. So the first question is, and I'll chain together the two. The first question is, how do you see current movements around digital sovereignty impacting the public procurement process and policy? And is that one of the deciding factors, or are deciding factors the standard things of cost, maintenance, functionality, that kind of stuff? The second question, which is actually very different, and it's maybe more of a statement than a question, is the, you've talked a lot about public procurement. Obviously, it's the focus of the call. I wonder how you see the overlap with a private business procurement. What I mean by that is that you often find within procurement departments in companies, and I don't know if it's the same within kind of national organizations, that open source doesn't even become visible. So it's not even a procurement question in that perspective, because procurement departments tend to deal with costed licenses. So when you're looking at open source where there's no cost, it's not even a visible question. So you see there's a great challenge to talk to purchasing departments and educate them around open source, because for them, they're maybe not incentivized around open source, because they're looking at how to deal with better contracts and all that kind of stuff. And the other side of things, of course, is projects and may not even be going into procurement departments. They may just be going straight out to the open source world and just grabbing the open source that they need. So I wonder if you have any comments about those two different points.
Well, digital sovereignty first. It depends whether what I didn't talk about today was the world perspective. I decided in the time that I had to just concentrate on the EU law, which is currently also UK law. But in that context, the EU law, digital sovereignty cannot be an issue, because if somebody were to say that we prefer such and such, it must be a nationally based a enterprise that can bid, then except outside areas like defence procurement and so forth, which have special rules, that would simply be so clearly in breach of the single market and the EU treaties that it would, nobody would even try it. But when you come into the world context, it becomes a lot more problematic, because we all know about the Chinese idea of digital sovereignty, but it's something that's also being pursued by Russia. Wearing a totally different hat, I was at the Council of Europe in Strasbourg at the end of last year, taking part in the international negotiations for a second additional protocol to the Budapest Cybercrime Convention, representing the CCBE, which is Federation of Bars and Law Societies in Europe. It was quite interesting, and we were kind of one of the few non-gov reps there, but there were people from the actual states, and it was quite interesting because the Russians were talking about this wonderful UN proposal that they were pursuing, but basically, I won't go into detail, but it was basically all about trying to shape the internet in Russia's image. So it's a very, very worrying trend on an international scale, and I'm not frightfully sure what you can do about it, because you will get the metaphorical brown envelopes so long as you don't have the legal structure. But private sector, I think you've got to be careful about that. I think it's basically a lobbying and an education exercise, really. I don't think that it would be either appropriate or proper to regulate private procurement. If I want to go out and buy something as a private individual, well, I jolly well should have the freedom to do that.
I think my question is less around the regulation of it and more around, would you see the various sovereignty discussions that are ongoing at the moment over the last year or so as pushing regional policy more towards open source?
I hope it is, but I don't know. Sorry, I'm not going to be drawn.
Okay. No, it's just an interesting discussion, because when we talk about procurement, we talk about the various benefits of software and open, and the different criteria we're using within the procurement departments. And I think there's a rise of this notion of sovereignty, whether it's digital sovereignty on a national level or as a roadmap control mechanism. That's quite interesting and maybe hasn't been as explored before as I think it is today. And then, of course, there's the second point I mentioned, which is, do you find within the public procurement processes that some projects don't actually become visible to the procurement process, not because of this cost threshold, but simply because open source is considered free and it's a non-visible asset?
Well, there's two ways it's non-visible. Yes, it's a non-visible asset. As I was saying, people are looking at the product offering. I mean, some of the big operators that we use on the cloud every day have a lot of open source in their coding, but we don't care when we go onto the web just exactly what platform is being used to deliver the service. But there's another and more worrying way which is invisible, and that is, remember my proposed tripartite division, which I think is more useful than the sort of double division. My tripartite division, which is above threshold, irrebuttable presumption that transborder issues are engaged, below threshold and the bottom level, none are engaged, and then that kind of middle level, if it's below threshold, there's a rebuttable presumption that none are engaged. Now, once you get below threshold, that gives to the procuring authority the opportunity for it to exercise its own judgment. It makes its own decision in the first instance as to whether or not there's a cross-border interest. And if it decides, it being below threshold, there's not a cross-border interest, then it won't advertise in the official journal or on the various e-procurement websites. So potential competitors will just simply never get to hear about it because it's already been decided the Treaty of Principles don't apply to us. We can just give it to this, you know, local provider whom we've worked with quite a lot without having a competition.
Iain, we're slightly over time and I'm seeing people starting to drop off. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to have you speak today. It was absolutely fascinating. You certainly won't be getting sacked by OpenUK over lunch or other.
Oh, good.
Thank you so much. Just to wrap up today, I will mention a few of our future sessions. Next Friday, we are going to have a more general open source history session. The speaker is actually to be announced, and I'm hoping to have a very exciting announcement on Monday about that. We then will have a session on the 8th of May, which is currently not advertised, which will be open source and patents with Keith Burgell, the CEO of Open Invention Network. And on the 15th of May, we will have Pam Chestick of the OSI board and a US attorney with probably the leading authority in trademarks and open source talking about trademarks. So we've got a great few weeks coming up. Hopefully they will get close to, if not match you, Iain, in terms of numbers of attendees, downloads, which I'm sure are yet to come for this talk, which has been recorded, and also interest. Iain, thanks very much. Thanks to all the future leaders. I know you're all working very hard and about to start your review next week. Iain, you may well want to see their output when they're ready to publish it in JOLTS for June.
Well, it occurs to me that we probably could usefully expand the Brexit chapter because I wrote it way back in January when it was very little known. There might be a bit more known by the summer and we might be able to expand that chapter.
Absolutely, and apparently we're holding to our 31st December date, COVID-19 aside, so I'm sure there's quite a lot to be added there. Thanks, Iain. Thanks, everybody. And I hope to see most of you, if not all of you, next week. Take care. Stay well. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.